Today's topic is one that's very near and dear to me, one that I'm very passionate about, and it's about Kaizen, which is the art and science of continuous improvement. Many of you might know Kaizen in lean manufacturing, right? So companies such as Toyota have used Kaizen in order to build amazing products. But what most people don't know is you can also use Kaizen in your daily life. And so my short talk today is going to be about how can you use Kaizen in your daily life. So if we go to the next slide, the agenda for today will be, we'll introduce what Kaizen is, and then followed by some tools and techniques you can use in your daily life, followed by an opportunity to ask any questions you may have. And finally, for those of you who are interested in the topic, an appendix of related works. But before we begin speaking about Kaizen, I'd like to share a quote that was on the next slide, which was very, very, very powerful for me, and which really just changed my life. The basic point is, you must acknowledge that we are backward, that many of our ways of doing things are inappropriate, and that we need to change. This was said by Deng Xiaoping, known as the architect of modern China. And the reason why this quote was so powerful for me is not that we should beat up on ourselves, but we should take an honest look at the situation and look for ways to improve in our daily life. So on the next slide, what is Kaizen? As I mentioned earlier, many of you know Kaizen because of the Toyota production system. Well, Kaizen is a Chinese or Japanese word for improvement, or simply change for better. And it's become synonymous with continuous improvement. The philosophy behind Kaizen is our way of life, including our work life, social life, home life, should be constantly improved, right? Taiichi Ohno, founder of the Toyota production system, said, "Re-improve what was improved for further improvement." What does Kaizen involve? It involves asking small questions, thinking small thoughts, taking small actions. So that's really the way one can look at Kaizen, whether you're using it at work or at home. It involves doing small things, taking small steps. So you don't try to reinvent the wheel in one day, rather you take small, quick steps toward improvement. And through Kaizen, we focus on the process, not the person. This is really important because it's really easy to misinterpret it and think, well, there's something wrong with me. No, you should never focus on the person. You should focus on the process. You improve the process, you can improve products, and of course, it leads also to personal improvement. And in a business sense, Kaizen is really focused on adding value. So one might ask, what is value? Well, typically value is defined as any action or process that a customer would be willing to pay for, right? And similarly, a word that is used often in Kaizen and lean manufacturing is waste. Well, similarly, waste is defined as a process that adds no value. This is so important. So when you think about Kaizen, when you think about your daily actions, whether at work or home, one should be focused on adding value and eliminating waste. But this leads us to the next point. And should we be too focused on results? No, results are neither everything nor the only thing. They are very important, but there's other things that are important too, such as morale, participation, discipline, communication skills, and so forth. So if we move on to the next slide, one might ask, why Kaizen? Why should we bother with this? Well, there are plenty of benefits actually. At work, Kaizen can help us cut costs, of course, because when you eliminate waste, you cut costs. Similarly, it'll help us improve processes. increase efficiency. Of course, all of this leads to increased profits, right? And then it's a virtuous cycle whereby you improve processes, you increase productivity, you increase profits, and of course, improving morale, right? Everyone knows that an organization or team that's functioning better will have better morale. And finally, of course, increasing the value to the customer. But Kaizen can also be used at home. How so? Well, we're going to get into that a little bit later, but we can also use Kaizen in our daily life at home to enhance relationships and also, believe it or not, increase enjoyment of tasks. With that being said, let's go on to the next slide and talk about some tools and techniques we can use. And for those of you, by the way, for those of you who are already familiar with Kaizen, you're going to already know about these tools, but we'll try to use a sort of daily life spin with these tools, as it were. So one of the most popular Kaizen tools is 5S, right? And you'll note here, sort, set in order, shine. Actually, there's a corresponding word in Japanese for each one of these that also starts with S. I've omitted them from the slides, but you can look into it if you have more interest in it. But essentially, 5S is a methodology that helps us clean and improve our environment. So the first S is sort, which of course involves sorting items and throwing out what's not needed. After you sort, you then can set in order, right? Which involves arranging the items in order. After you've done that, the third S, shine, involves keeping your workplace clean or your home clean and free of clutter. After you've done these first three steps, the next one's really important. Standardize, right? So you've sorted your environment, you've set things in order, you've cleaned things up, but now in order to make sure that you maintain this sort of cleanliness, we standardize. How so? By using checklists, standards, work instructions to keep your work area or your home area clean. And finally, the last S, which is the most challenging one, is sustain. So it's not simply not good enough just to sort and set in order, shine, standardize. You might have some instructions, some checklists, and so forth. You've got to make sure you can sustain this, right, over a long period of time. That involves performing these actions consistently and repeatedly. So in an organization, sustain, this last step really requires management assistance and management support, right? At home, sustain involves performing these actions so often that it just becomes a way of life. So 5S is a really powerful tool to use often when you're beginning an improvement project, whether at the office or at home. It's a really powerful tool to use to first get your environment in order, if you will. And so we then move on to the next tool, which is one of my personal favorites. It's called Kanban, which is essentially a signboard, right? What is Kanban? Well, it is the primary tool of a pull system versus a push system. And so the way to think about this is, in a pull system, right, supplies and parts are pulled when needed, right? This is really what enabled Toyota to implement its just-in-time manufacturing methodology, right? So as opposed to pushing everything through, right, and resulting in gridlock and all different kinds of waste, which I will talk about in a future slide, a pull system allows us to pull parts and inventory only when we need it. What are some of the benefits? Well, you get to reduce inventory, you improve productivity, right? Because you only pull what you need. This also allows you to decrease costs. And most importantly, this gives you a predictable flow of materials and information. So all of this is fine and dandy. You might be asking, well, how can I use Kanban in my daily life? Well, on the next slide, this is a very, mind you, this is a very, very simplified version of a Kanban board. Believe it or not, I actually have one of these in my house, and it's really simple. Look, you can just take a whiteboard, if you will, and just draw some columns, right? And on the left-hand column, we have to do, right? So, and you can use Post-it notes for the tasks that you've got to complete, right? As you can see here on the slides. So on the left-hand column, we've got a whole bunch of tasks that we've got to do, right? When you start a task, you can simply move the Post-it note to the center column, doing, that's currently in progress. After you're done, you can simply stick it in the done column. So again, you're not just limited to 3 columns. It might be more than 3 columns, right? It might be 5 columns. But the point of having Kanban at home is it gives you a visual representation of what you're currently working on and what you have yet to work on, but it's in the backlog, so to speak. And finally, it gives you a really good representation of, well, what are the tasks that I've completed? And believe it or not, you can use this for household tasks. Whatever you need to do at home, you can use a Kanban board. And I personally find it really powerful because we all have so many tasks to perform, not just at the office, but also at home. And this is a really powerful way to do that. And again, it's really simple. It doesn't cost much money at all. All you've got to do is get a whiteboard, right? Or you may even decide to use some software-based solution. Of course, if you work in the software industry, there's plenty of tools that'll allow you to have a Kanban board. And if you do work in software, I'm sure you've used some derivation of this. And we previously talked about waste. So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about value, but mostly about waste. If you're familiar with the Toyota production system, you may have heard a term called Muda, which in Japanese means waste. So there are numerous kinds of waste. When we talk about Kaizen and lean manufacturing, there are really 7 main types of waste, and I will talk about each one of those. The first type is overproduction, right? What does that mean? Well, simply put, you make more goods than needed, right? What's an example at home? Making too much food, right? And you end up throwing some of it away. So overproduction is a really common waste in a business setting. And that one's very clear, right? Another type of waste, and by the way, not all types of waste are really clear. Some are very obvious, but there are other types of waste that are not that obvious, right? What is one of these? Well, excess motion. What's an example? Perfect example. Unnecessarily searching for items, right? So this goes back to 5S. If you implement 5S at the office or at home, you won't need to unnecessarily search for items. They will be in a place where you can easily get them, right? Third category, which I find happens all the time. Another sort of waste is waiting. What's an example? Let's just say you work in a factory or a shop and you're part of a process, waiting for the previous step to be completed, right? People are idle, people don't get to do their work. And so this is a really huge waste in a business setting. And then that one's quite obvious, right? Another really obvious one is inventory. What's an example here? Well, at home, accumulating too many items in one's closets or one's garage. I'm sure a lot of people can definitely relate to this, right? This is an obvious one. Another type of waste, excess movement of material or transportation. What does this mean? Well, any type of movement of materials that doesn't support the immediate production of goods or services. What's an example? Well, in a manufacturing plant, you might have function-oriented departments together, right? This one is a little bit more difficult to give an example for, but if you've ever worked in a manufacturing plant or a shop environment, you'll know what I mean. What's another type of waste? Defect correction. Let me give you an example. In the software industry, producing software that has a lot of defects results in a lot of wasted time, angry customers, and so forth. And of course, the time you then have to spend fixing the defect is a huge waste. Finally, the seventh type of waste is excess processing, a redundant effort that adds no value. Here's an example. Designing product features that the customer doesn't want. Now, you might think that your customer would love all these extra features, but that's not necessarily the case. So we've really got to take a close look at what am I building, and do people actually want this? So that was a lot of talk about the workplace. The next example on the next slide is one of my personal favorites, and I love it because it's just so simple. And to give you some background, the 5 whys was a tool that was developed in a manufacturing environment. But I have found that this tool has equal, if not greater, application in our daily lives. What is the 5 whys tool? Well, it's an iterative method to explore cause and effect relationships. What do I mean by that? Well, I'd like to give an example from daily life I'm sure many people can relate with. Let's just say you had an argument with your spouse, right? Let's just say a husband has had an argument with his wife, and the conversation didn't go as planned. So after the fact, we start asking why. For example, why did my wife abruptly end the conversation? Well, because she was upset. Why was she upset? Well, because she says I wasn't listening to her. Why would she say I wasn't listening to her? Because I was offering her advice about her situation. But why would I offer her advice? Well, not just because I love her, but because I was hoping to get to a resolution to her problem. That's really important for me, to get to a resolution. But why was I trying to get to a resolution as soon as possible? Well, because I'm a man, and as you know, men are problem solvers. We even try to solve problems of emotions. Aha. So as you can see, this is a really, really powerful tool to help us get to, sometimes get to a root cause, right? But please keep in mind a couple of things. One, it doesn't necessarily have to be asking the question why 5 times. It might take you 7 or 8 whys. Similarly, it might take you only 3 whys, right? The point is to take an honest assessment and looking at the root cause. And another thing to note is when we use this tool, it's sort of risky in that you might put blame on yourself or someone else. We don't want to do that. We simply want to look at the situation and look at the facts, and then using this iterative method, come to a better understanding of the situation. This is a real life example. You might find this really funny, but there's actually a lot of truth to it, right? And so the point is not to look at, things that are wrong with men or things that are wrong with women, or even things that are wrong in the relationship, but taking an honest and objective look at the situation and then pledging improvement. right? But using the 5 whys I found is really powerful, not just in a business setting, but also in a personal setting, right? I found it's really, really, really helpful in terms of improving relationships. So the next time you have perhaps an argument or a debate with someone that doesn't quite go as you hoped, maybe you should use the 5 whys tool. After the fact, take some time to relax, take some time to ponder about the situation, and then start asking why. You might be really surprised at what you find. And so on the next slide, we have another tool called the Ishikawa diagram. It's also called a fishbone diagram. And it's called the fishbone diagram because that's really what it resembles when you draw it out. This is a graphical analysis tool that helps us illustrate. Again, the 5 whys was talking about root cause. Ishikawa diagram is also another way to find the root cause, but we're using a different tool, right? Whereas the 5 whys is iterative and it's logically proceeding from one step to the next. The Ishikawa diagram is a graphical way to approach root cause analysis, right? So how do we do it? And by the way, there's an example on the next slide. We won't go there yet, but there's an example on the next slide where I'll show you how to do it. But doing an Ishikawa diagram, you don't even need software to do it. You can simply take a piece of paper, draw a box on the right-hand side, draw a line that points to the box. In the box, you write a description of whatever the problem might be. This is what is called the effect. After you do that, you can write categories above and below the horizontal line you just drew. And then, of course, write detailed causes for each category. So I know it's kind of difficult to visualize without seeing the diagram. So on the next slide, you'll note an Ishikawa diagram, right? So as you'll note on the right-hand side, you see the orange box, effect. In that box, you'll want to write down what the actual problem is, whatever it might be, whether it's a broken part of a process, or it's a bug in a software, or you could even use this in a personal setting, right? And as you'll note, there's the horizontal line, right? And as you'll note, there are various categories. The black boxes are for categories. And for each category, you might have one or more causes, right? So it's really important to note, you might only have one cause for a category, right? Or you might have multiple causes for the category. The Ishikawa diagram is a very powerful way to graphically list what a problem is, and then try to work your way back and look at the various root causes. Now, mind you, you might have more than one root cause for the problem. This is a really powerful way to figure that out. Yet another tool we can use, and on the next slide, if you've worked in a manufacturing environment, is PDCA. What is PDCA? Well, it's an improvement cycle methodology. It was developed initially as a result of solving problems, and more importantly, to prevent the recurrence of problems, right? It's not just about solving a problem. You also want to make sure that the problem doesn't appear again. What does PDCA stand for? Well, P stands for plan, which involves defining what the problem is and coming up with some various solutions and causes, right? Once you have that done, you go to do, which is implementing the solution, right? So you've defined the problem, you found the root causes, you found the solution, then you actually implement the solution, after which you check, which is evaluate the results, right? And what happens if you check and it turns out the results are not satisfactory? If they're unsatisfactory, you simply go back to P, plan, right? And maybe you come up with a different solution. You implement the solution, you check. This time, if it actually works, you standardize the solution, right? Perhaps by, again, going back to 5S, right? The fourth S of 5S, standardize, either by having new documentation or worksheets or checklists. But I'd like to stress, PDCA can also be used not just at the office, but also at home, right? Everyone has problems at home, right? Or challenges at home to resolve. Define the problem, come up with some root causes or solutions, implement the solution, check, did it work? Yes. Standardize it and make sure that the problem doesn't recur again. So on the next slide is a graphical analysis of PDCA. And I know obviously the text is quite small there, but the way you should think about PDCA is not just a straight line. You should think about it as a circle, right? It's a virtuous cycle, right? You go from plan to do to check to act and so forth. So that's really the way to think about it. It's a four-step problem-solving method for continuous process improvement. That's really the key word there, continuous process improvement. Once you've resolved the problem, you can always try for further improvements, right? So that's really the way to think about it. It's a circle, not a straight line. And finally, the last tool we will discuss today on the next slide is called Hansei, Japanese term for self-reflection. What does this involve? This involves acknowledging one's mistakes and pledging improvement. How do we do Hansei? Well, you can do it as a group whereby you hold a self-reflection meeting and you help identify failures experienced along the way, right? You look at what didn't work, what worked, and for what didn't work, you create a plan for future efforts, right? But I'd like to stress with Hansei, the most important step is not necessarily the problem solving, but identifying the root cause. Remember, we just spoke about making sure that these problems don't recur, right? But Hansei is not only used in East Asia, it's also used in the West in what's called a sprint retrospective, right? For anybody who works in the software industry, right, you've got sprint. If you use the Scrum methodology, you have stand-up meetings and sprint planning meetings, and then at the end of the sprint, you have a sprint retrospective, whereby you discuss, here's what worked, here's what didn't work, and now we can pledge improvement on the things that didn't work. Hansei is a very, very, very powerful tool. But again, I'd like to stress, when we use these tools, we shouldn't focus on the person. We should always focus on the process and how to improve the process.